These are examples of seams that we will make in a sewing machine. I'm still using 2 by 2 decimeter squares to make these samples, but this time I'm using my cotton silecia. The straight seam is the basic seam we will sew practically all the time. We start with laying 2 layers of cloth together. We will sew a seam on the machine with a 1 cm seam allowance, so the stitch will be 1 cm from the raw edges, which is the standard when we work with metric measurements. We can baste the piece of cloth together next to where we want to machine, which will still be about 1 cm from the raw edge. We can baste next to a seam anytime we feel we need it. We can backtack at the start of the seam, which is using the reverse function of the sewing machine for a few stitches to create 2 seams on top of one another. We can backtack at the start of the seam, which is using the reverse function of the sewing machine for a few stitches to create 2 seams on top of one another to hold each other in place. On machines, there are markings that we can align the raw edges up to. We can follow that as we feed the cloth through the machine. We can backtack the stitch at the end as well, cutting the cloth free from the machine. Whenever we use the machine, as bespoke tailors, we will always cut down our threads after we have sewn a seam, always. With this straight seam, we will press the seam open. Firstly though, we will almost always press this stitching as it is, flat. This relieves any tightness created by the machine and the stitching. Then we open the 2 seams. Spreading the 2 pieces of fabric apart, with the raw seam on top, we will also spread the 2 raw edges, ironing them apart. This is the simplest machined seam. Making a straight seam with inlay is very similar to the first. However, with one of our pieces of cloth, I'm going to chalk a line 2.5 centimeters from one of the raw edges. This 2.5 centimeters on the raw edge is inlay now. This is extra cloth that we can use if our original seam is put in the wrong place. We can remove the stitching and move where the chalk line is, and the chalk line represents the edge of our seam allowance here. Hence, to make this seam, line up the raw edge of another one of our pieces of cloth up to the chalk. With the inlay, we can't see the grooves on the machine, but sewing machines will often have some kind of guide that you can use to see the standard seam allowance. I can move my needle over to the left and then line the raw edge and the chalk up to the foot of my machine to give me a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Again, we can backtack at the start and end. Once again, we press the seam flat before opening up the seam allowance and pressing the 2 raw edges apart. For the top stitch seam, I will make this seam with inlay again, but I'm going to make it without basting it first. We can put this through the machine with a 1 centimeter seam allowance again. This is where this becomes a top-stitched seam. We press the stitching flat, because we always do, but we will press both seams instead of apart to one side. Spread open the main cloth and fold over the seam allowances and inlay to one side. Make sure the cloth is open all the way to the stitching and iron the seam allowance and inlay to one side, usually with the inlay we iron on top of the seam allowance. This is where the top stitch comes in. We will go back to the machine and make another stitch from the front of the cloth, from the correct side of cloth, the side without the raw edges on the seam. We will machine another stitch next to the original seam, importantly on the side that the seam allowances and inlay are folded into. We can sew any distance from the seam. We could sew a few millimeters from the seam, which we would refer to as edge stitching, or 5 millimeters or a centimeter, depends on what you want. We can prick stitch the top stitch if we want the handcraft details as well. This keeps the seam allowances fastened in place. We will press the machining flat, and that is what a top stitched seam is. It can be used as a trouser detail sometimes, and is often used when machining lining onto another cloth. The French seam hides raw edges between two seams, used mostly when making pockets for trousers and shirts where they won't be covered. We start the seam by putting the wrong sides of the cloth together rather than the right sides, like we have with the rest of the seam. I am marking the X's onto the wrong sides to demonstrate it here. We can sew the first seam with a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. Again, machines will often have markings or a method of finding exactly where half a standard seam allowance is. We can press this seam flat. We can trim down the raw edges of this seam by a few millimeters so that we can sufficiently cover it by a second seam. We will open up the main portion of the cloth now and fold it over the raw edges. We need to pull the stitching to the very edge of the seam and we'll iron the cloth. In this case, we want the two pieces of cloth to be directly on top of one another and folded equally. We can use a pin or a needle as well to stick into the seam and tug on the stitching. However, it is very important that we pull on the stitching and not the cloth. Otherwise, we might pull out a piece of the grain from the cloth. We can baste the two so that they stay equal in the machine as well. We will sew them with a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance again. This way, the raw edges of the seam are hidden from the inside and the outside. The flat felled seam is usually used on shirts to hide raw edges as well. We start sewing the raw edges with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance this time. Again, the machine will often have markings for that. From here, we start like we do a top stitch. We press the two sides of the cloth apart, but the seam allowances to one side. We will now cut the seam allowance underneath in half. We will move the seam allowance on top out of the way and cut away at least half of the bottom seam. We will fold the top seam allowance underneath itself to touch the first line of machining. We are best off folding it such that the seam allowance we cut is inside of the fold of the top seam allowance. We'll iron the seam allowance over as we fold it. We can then put pins or baste the seam to hold it down as we machine it. We machine the seam with the seam allowances on top, unlike the top stitch. We are edge stitching the seam allowance as close to the fold as is feasible. We can remove the pins and or baste. This is our shirt seam. Both raw edges are completely hidden, like the French seam. Unlike the French seam, the seam we create lets the cloth sit flat.